Nathan, can the arts inform the philosophy of religion, particularly the various kinds of subcategories?
Well, I think...
Are arts a data point, or data points that you can use to develop philosophy of religion?
Yeah. I think the arts could be used in some ways to explore the philosophy of religion, but this is somewhat of an open question in my mind. Because...
Give me both sides.
Okay. Well, I think on the one hand, there's the one challenge. Well, I'll start in the defense side of it. You know, surely when we're engaging in art, we're engaging different parts of different operative cognitive processes. We're engaging in different types of possible analogies or ways of thinking, right, than we might otherwise when we're doing propositional information or propositional claims. So it seems like, well, that might be promising for opening up new ideas, new insights, perhaps new types of experiences. But now, of course, the challenge on the other side is to say, well, at the end of the day, if the limitations that we face when, say, reasoning about God are limitations because we're dealing in circumscribed concepts, right? We're dealing in limitations like three-sidedness or color or whatever it is. Well, we really haven't escaped those limitations when we move into the arts. We're still working within concepts. Now we might be interacting with the concepts in a different way. Talking about red versus perceiving red directly, right? Listening to a sound versus talking about how sound works. Okay, sure. But the challenge would be to say, well, it's still working within the same set of concepts that we're working with in the philosophy of religion. So I think it's a worthwhile question that needs to be explored. But in my mind, it's still an open-end. The answer is still somewhat open-ended.
Well, most questions in religion you can answer on both sides, so I wouldn't call that unique. But let's see if we can explore further, because there are at least two kinds of levels that the arts can be used to enhance one's belief, and then the question is whether that belief is tied in any real sense to an ontological reality. I mean, that's a two-step process. Or is the arts connected with that reality, or the arts can enhance belief? I think it's fairly well recognized that the arts can enhance at least the emotional valences of belief. Whether that's different from other kinds of emotions is questionable.
Right.
But you do have those separate parts.
Sure. Well, and I do think, in terms of issues of epistemology, for example, I tend to have existential, leanings on many of these fronts.
What does that mean?
Well, what I mean is that there's an inevitable risk factor that you could be wrong, and you have to go down a certain road in order to find out. First time I spoke at University of Kentucky at the philosophy department there, I spoke about Kant's problem of divine revelation. So Immanuel Kant objects to the very possibility that he doesn't object that God might reveal himself. He objects to the idea that if God revealed himself, we could recognize that it's God. And the reason largely had to do with the limitations of our concepts. He shows up as a burning bush. Well, that's very weird, but how do I know it's God? That's sort of Kant's problem. And I offered a response drawing from the Eastern Church Fathers to that problem. And I drew out the difference in how Kant understands revelation, which is really God showing up to your eyes or to your ears, versus the way the Eastern Church Fathers talk about revelation, which is really a type of participation. They talk about the individual somehow participating in God and being metamorphosized by that participation. And that type of metamorphosis means, in some ways, you're not experiencing God with your faculties in the normal sense. Well, the problem is that opens up the question, well, how do you know that that's really possible? And the answer is, well, you go through an entire lifetime of pursuing God and see if you have any success. There's always a gamble that you're wrong. And that's the existential side of it, is that there's no getting around the risk that comes with it.
Yeah, and what the difference is in that internal feeling versus an internal feeling that you might have for a host of other reasons, including eating bad food or taking a drug or any type of other alcoholic beverage. Anything could create a different kind of feeling. I mean,
Right.
we see that.
Right.
We see that throughout.
Yeah. So now the reason I bring that up is because when it comes to the arts, I think some of the questions that begin to emerge about whether or not they might be conduits for certain types of experiences that might otherwise be inaccessible to us, or even taking the Eastern Orthodox concept that it's not just humans that can participate in God, but artifacts can be conduits for God as well. And so through sacred objects, you might actually have direct experiences of God's operations in the world. Okay. Those are interesting questions and open up interesting possibilities, but there's an existential component to it. It's not a sheerly abstract question. It in some ways becomes an experimental, a lived question.
As far as experimental, I would be surprised if anybody has done a double-blind experiment where you have one icon tell people, well, this was blessed, and
Right.
you tell the other one, this
Sure.
was not blessed, and which one makes you feel better.
Right.
I think we would know the answer to
Right,
that pretty
and that's
easily.
where I certainly don't use experimental in the sense that we start taking them into the lab and trying to measure certain things. But nonetheless, it is a certain experiment, so to speak, or when somebody enters into a certain lifestyle in the belief that that lifestyle will lead to a certain end.
Is there any possibility of using sort of the analytical tools that are in analytic philosophy to at least hone the problem better in terms of the arts in its capacity to generate the feelings that we associate with religious feelings?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there are possibilities. I think there's possibilities of doing, here I think there's real experimental possibilities. There would be valuable research that I could conceive of being done in terms of, are there certain sounds or images that elicit the holy, right? Are there certain things that elicit the demonic, right, that inherently have this menacing quality to them? And seeing if you can, in some ways, identify sort of artistic conduits for those sorts of things that are not reducible to just cultural impulses or a person's individual tradition and prior assumptions.
Something really deeply intrinsic?
Yeah, something that seems to be
I'd be really surprised if you could do that.
Well, I would be surprised. You mean surprised that if you could find it, or if that was the result of the findings?
Right.
Well,
Right, or in tying into some reality, but
Right.
I'm prepared to be surprised.
Yeah, I would be prepared to be surprised too.